Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today's workshop. This is the second workshop of our week. Today, it's about economic, environmental, and supply chain aspects of steel decarbonization. We have a great panel today, and let's start. Let's go right ahead to it. Our first speaker is going to be uh, Benoit Chachuat. I don't know if I say it correctly, but uh, he's a professor, Sargent Center for Process System Engineering, the Imperial College of London, and he's gonna be doing a brief introduction for the workshop today. So, Benoit, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Fernando. Can I check with you? Is my camera working, or because I joined on the phone and on the computer? Yeah, you can see me.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, we
Because I
can see
cannot
you
see myself,
perfectly.
so I don't know. All right. So
We see
thank you
you
very
just
much
fine.
for introducing me. So a very good morning. Warm welcome to everyone who's attending today's workshop on economic, environmental, and supply chain aspects. If you don't know me, yes, I'm Benoit Chachuat. I'm a professor of process systems engineering at Imperial College London. I will be quickly introducing the workshop this morning, just talk for about 10 minutes and hand over to the main speakers. Just one thing before I do my introduction about housekeeping, we would appreciate if you could keep your microphones on mute, and that's to avoid disrupting the speakers during their presentations. Thank you for that. All right, so more about the workshop now. I have a few high-level slides in order to introduce the topic, and I talking about the steel industry and then moving on to the H2STEEL process concept. So the slide that I'm currently flashing is illustrating, I think, the scale of the problem that we have in steel manufacturing. And I think those numbers are important for us to keep in mind. So first of all, concerning global steel production, it was estimated to be around 1.9 billion tons in 2024 last year. And that's, of course, a huge number. And I think it puts steel in third position on the list of man-made bulk materials worldwide. And to put things a bit in perspective, in cement production worldwide, we have in excess of 4 billion tons. So about 2 billion tons for steel is not so far from that. Plastic production is about 400 million tons. So that's a lot less than what we're talking about for steel, and already a huge problem as well. Now, if we're turning to CO2 emissions, the steel sector is the largest emitter across the heavy industries. The total CO2 emissions is about 2.6 gigatons of CO2 per year, and that makes about 7% of global CO2 emissions. So 7%, that is a huge number as just one sector. And of course, if we do the math, we take this 2.6 gigatons and the production, we see that for every ton of steel we're producing, we're going to be emitting about 1.4 tons of CO2 on that's the world's average. Now that's an average, and not all steel production is the same. Currently, the cheapest and the most popular process of steel making worldwide remains this technology called BF-BOF, and it stands for blast furnace basic oxygen furnace. And if you look at the diagram that I show on the left of the slide here, it happens to be a two-step process. So in the first step, what we have is coal and limestone being mixed together with the iron ore in the blast furnace, where iron reduction is performed and produces molten iron. And then this molten iron is going to go to the second stage, and it's sent to this basic oxygen furnace in order to be converted into steel. One key point here is that this BF-BOF process relies heavily on coal. And both steps, in fact, produce CO2 as a byproduct. So overall, the direct emission of the BF-BOF process are about 2.3 tons of CO2 per ton of steel. So that's a lot more than the 1.4 ton per ton that I was showing on average earlier. Now, an alternative process to BF-BOF is DRI-EAF, and that stands for direct reduced iron electric arc furnace. It's also a two-stage process. And now if you focus on the diagram on the right of the slide, the idea of this process is that in the DRI, iron ore is now mixed with natural gas, which acts as a reducing agent in order to produce pure iron. And this iron is then fed into the electric arc furnace in order to be converted into steel. Now, with natural gas used as the reducing agent in DRI, of course, that's significantly cleaner than coal, and the direct emissions are significantly lower as a result, and it's around 1.4 tons of CO2 per tons of steel. Now, here we're talking about primary steel production. There's also the use of electrical arc furnace for steel recycling from scrap, and that's not the focus here. Now, I think what's interesting to mention at this point is that if we were to replace natural gas by hydrogen as the reducing agent in the DRI process, we could reduce even further the CO2 emissions. And there is also the possibility of course, operating the electric arc furnace using or switching to low carbon electricity in order to drive CO2 emissions also lower. So by and large, these strategies that I mentioned in terms of using hydrogen as a reducing agent or low carbon electricity are very much the baseline of the H2STEEL process. And on this slide, I am showing a sort of summary diagram of the main steps of our process concept. The key innovations in H2STEEL are around the use of biomethane in order to produce green hydrogen. And this production is based on catalytic cracking of biomethane, or it's also called methane pyrolysis. And so in order to produce that hydrogen. And so what is also appealing about using methane pyrolysis is that the carbon byproduct that is produced from the pyrolysis can also be used in steel making. And of course, it reduces the dependency on fossil-derived carbon inputs to the process. But also, if we're moving upstream the steel making plant, the H2STEEL process is also investigating the production of the biomethane itself, and we're looking at the use of renewable waste in order to do that, and particularly the conversion of sewage sludge from a network of wastewater treatment plants. So here again, there is an important synergistic effect between the conversion of or the generation of biogas from this waste and the conversion of the digestate into biocoal, this time using slow pyrolysis, and this biocoal can in turn be used as the catalytic material in order to convert the biomethane into green hydrogen. And that displaces the use of conventional metallic catalysts, for instance. So as you can see, there are plenty of synergistic effects in the H2STEEL process concept in order to reduce environmental impacts, and also hopefully in the end to be able to increase the economic competitiveness of sustainable steel production. Now, quickly talking about the H2STEEL consortium. We are, so in the consortium, we have three main academic partners. There is Politecnico di Torino, who are also the project coordinator, the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, and us ourselves at Imperial College. We're also partnering with Record, which is an Italian consulting company. I was focusing on research and demonstration in biomass and bioenergy. ArcelorMittal, our main industrial partner in the project. We're working with I3P, which are an incubator at the University of Torino. And finally, Contactica, who are looking after the project management. What I should add is that we are now in the final stages of the H2STEEL project. Several of the partners I mentioned have been focusing on technological innovations in either methane pyrolysis or the slow pyrolysis of the digestate. But another key outcome of the project is an assessment of the economic viability and the environmental sustainability of this H2STEEL process concept I was showing. And ultimately, we hope that we can inform, for instance, EU policy in the steel sector based on our results. So that will be my final slide for the introduction. Our workshop this morning is very much around these economic, environmental, and supply chain aspects of H2STEEL. And that's a quick agenda for what we're going to be presenting. I think that's an exciting program, and I would like to take the opportunity to thank the three speakers and the panel moderator for their contributions to the workshop. Quickly going through the program, I will invite, in a few minutes, Gbemi to give the first talk on economic levers for steel decarbonization. Gbemi is an assistant professor at the Grantham Institute for Climate Change at Imperial College. She's also an associate director of the Sargent Center for Process Systems Engineering. After Gbemi, I'll invite Nemi to give her a presentation on steel decarbonization insights using prospective LCA. A few words about Nemi. She's a senior PhD student at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands. Then we'll have a short break, and then after coming back, Jan will give the third presentation. She will be talking to us about supply chain optimization and sludge-derived biocoal and hydrogen from this DRI EAF steel production and presenting a case study. And finally, we'll have a final half-an-hour session, which will be moderated by Andrea, who's a research fellow at the Sargent Center. Sorry, I forgot to say Jan is a research associate at the Sargent Center at Imperial College. So Andrea will be moderating the panel. So what I'm asking you to kindly do is to please keep your questions. That's any questions you may have from the talks, because the panel will also be the opportunity for you to interact with the speakers and ask your question. And at this point, I'm also going to apologize because I cannot stay for the workshop. I'm being called in another meeting. So unfortunately, I will not be able to attend that. Right, so without further ado, I think I will stop sharing my screen, and I will invite Gbemi to share her screen and give a presentation. Thank you, Gbemi. There we are.
Thank you, Benoit. So I'm just going to share my screen.
And I'm already 5 minutes late, I notice. That's not good.
Yeah, I'll try my best to get us back to time. I'm hoping you're seeing the right screen. Okay, thank you. Well, I've recently been promoted to Associate Professor of Sustainable Market Mechanisms. I'm still sort of saying it until I get it out of my system. But anyway, my presentation today will cover what sort of economic levers are necessary to make steel decarbonization economically viable. I lead market interventions for Deep Decarbonization's lab here at Imperial, located at Grantham Institute. And I thought I'll give a broad overview of what we do before I go into the specific application case for steel. So at MidLab, we try to answer 4 questions: how to improve the economic viability of decarbonization solutions, especially in heavy sectors. How can we finance their uptake, especially creating a demand pool for them? And how do we generate sufficient demand pool to scale? Because we know if you have good demand, then you can trigger learning effects and economies of scale. and that will reduce the price of the product. We also answer questions around how do you trigger economic tipping points for these sustainable products. So at what point will they become cost competitive with the business as usual? And finally, how do you induce diffusion over time? Because for most players in the space of steel and other heavy sectors, it's very important for them to maintain their market shares. At the center of all these questions is how we use market mechanisms really as the economic lever. So it includes emission trading scheme, carbon taxes, tax credits, some subsidies, contracts for difference, carbon contracts for difference, as a way to sort of tilt the economics just to support the uptake of decarbonization technologies and the product. So in my group, we developed these models to look at how market mechanisms answer these 4 questions in 6 key deep decarbonization technologies, from CCUS to hydrogen to electrification. And we focus on heavy sectors. So these sectors combined together, I think, are responsible for between 30 and 38% of global CO2 emission. And they don't seem to go anywhere, to be going anywhere in the next 30, 40 years. But today, I'll focus on iron and steel. So I've brought together all the work we've done on iron and steel from a plant to a global perspective, and to a regional perspective as well. And we'll see this sort of economic viability, how it changes with existing market mechanisms today. We'll go from CCUS to make blue steel, to hydrogen, to green steel using hydrogen, and see the sort of economics. So Benoit already showed this slide. So today, majority of steel making, I think between 70 and 75%, is based on the BF, so the blast furnace, blast oxygen furnace. And that 20 to 25% or so is based on the electric arc furnace. And there are different ways of decarbonizing steel. For the projects we've looked at in my group, we've looked at natural gas, blue hydrogen, green hydrogen, but today I'll focus on carbon capture, utilization and storage in BF plants and green hydrogen in DREF plants. Now, what we do is to, again, collect the data of all operational plants. So there are about 224 operational plants as at the time we collected this data, and there are about 161 DRIEF plants. So we understand the spread of these plants around the world, as well as the capacity of these plants, whether they are the conventional plants or the DRIEF plants. Now, in doing the economic assessments, I'll just show results of a plant. So this is just a reference plant in Europe. The capacity is about 4 million, makes 4 million tons of steel. You have an idea about the OPEX of the plants and the price of steel. Now, for this reference plant in Europe, today, today with no policies, no CCUS to make blue steel, the NPV is like $2.4 billion. So, in fact, the internal rate of return is about 18%, which is higher than the weighted average cost of capital. So that means steel will be a good business, without CCS and without any sort of market-based mechanisms, which are policies. Now, if you integrate CCUS into this plant to make blue steel, the NPV becomes negative. Of course, there is a positive impact in terms of reduction in carbon emissions, but the NPV becomes negative and the IRR drops below the WACC. That means investment in steel becomes uneconomically viable, and integrating CCS into the plant drives a loss. The price of steel also increases. Now, I'll just show the results of this sort of analysis for reference plants, operational plants today in different parts of the world. And then we see there are some very profitable plants today where there is no sort of policies. And once you integrate CCUS, the most profitable becomes, you drop from about 19.4 billion that's billion, yes, dollars in NPV to about 2. So it's a loss globally if we were to transition to blue steel. And that's why we have market mechanisms, and we do have market mechanisms today. So this is data we've collected. I must say it's a very dynamic space. But this is data we've collected of market mechanisms all over the world, from carbon taxes. So the green means that there are no market mechanisms. So most countries, well, a few countries have carbon taxes. About 38 or so countries have emission trading schemes. And all these apply to the steel sector as a heavy sector, and which of course show the ETS allowance in different countries. Some countries have subsidies either for CCS or hydrogen or incentives, and some countries interestingly have like direct grants to support the sector in transitioning. So we collected the data for all these market mechanisms to see if they are good economic levers to make steel decarbonization economically viable. And if I go back to the reference plant that I showed you before, where it was not good news with CCS. Now, having policy, so in the EU, we've got the emission trading scheme. With the emission trading scheme in the EU, this plant is not economically viable because they're basically paying the tax. And in fact, if you don't have any policies and you just integrate CCS, even though it's still not economically viable, it's better than just an ETS scheme. And you still have some IRR, so but the levelized cost of steel increases. And so what we then did with this reference plant was to apply the model to say, what does the optimal policy need to be to make the NPV greater than 0, and to make the internal rate of return above the WACC, just to make it economically viable, not just to cover the cost of the additional technology, but to make the business still viable. And the result was actually a carrot and a stick. So still with the ETS, but with a subsidy, because a subsidy will be a revenue stream to the steel plant, and that way we can have a positive NPV, a WACC of about 17%, but the levelized cost of steel is still very high. So that means we need to think about market mechanisms or market creation across the value chain from production to consumption, because this cost is still high. Of course, we can ask the model to find the policies and keep the price the same or within a percentage that consumers are willing to pay, and find what the policies should be. Again, we apply these models to show what this mix of policies need to be in all countries that have a steel plant, a blast furnace, blast oxygen furnace. And we just see here the spread of ETS prices, which is currently higher than what we have today, but it needs to be balanced with a subsidy as an economic lever. And so it's almost saying if there is an ETS in a country and steel plants need to pay this ETS price, the government needs to recycle that money back as a subsidy to sort of support the transition, or to support the integration of CCUS in blast furnace, blast oxygen plants, furnace BOF plants, to make them economically viable in most countries. Now, another part of the work I did was to look at green steel. So now we've looked at blue steel, and to look at green steel, because there are the policies to support or to prevent the production of conventional gray steel a lot more than policies to support green steel across the world. So we zoomed into a region, into China, because China seems to have a lot of policies to support green steel, but also a lot of strategies to grow or to transition the steel sector. So in the next set of results or discussions, I'll focus on green steel in China. So the summary of blue steel is, these levers are great, but they are not sufficient. But let's look at green steel in China. So China is one of the biggest producers of steel. The blast oxygen furnace dominates. About 90% of steel is from the BOF, and we looked at the distribution of these plants in China, and looking at their capacity by province for the basic oxygen furnace operating steel, as well as EAF steel plants. Now, what we're trying to do with this project was to understand where the potential for green steel is. And because there was no sort of secondary data to input into the model, we had to go back to the basis to start modeling the renewable capacity to hydrogen generation. So we identified like 32 provinces in China that can make green steel based on the projects already in those provinces, and based on these sort of cities being a major steel city, there's a lot of supporting policy for green steel, and there's scrap availability in most of these provinces. Not all of them have a large-scale infrastructure plan, but we just assume that the infrastructure will align with the policies. So for this particular case study, because of the lack of secondary data, because we use secondary data to analyze the policies, we had to go back to the basis to look at the cost inputs for raw material, to all characteristics, geographic scope, to renewable energy data, real time, understanding the energy supply model, hydrogen production model, material flow model, energy storage model, the technical limits, so we can do the economic viability and understand how current market mechanisms, or if current market mechanisms in China make green steel cost competitive. So I'll spare you the details of the model, but it's really an interesting modeling framework. And what, yes?
Excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think your presentation is no longer being shared. I don't know if
Oh,
something happened along the way, but
okay. I
but
am
you were
happy to
speaking and I
reshare.
didn't see your presentation, so uh,
Oh, I will
if you
reshare it.
could share
Sorry.
it again, just
Yeah.
please go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so I don't know. I described the methodology, so just a quick overview of the answer. So this just shows that within these 32 provinces in China, you can get cheap renewables, but again, hydrogen is quite expensive. Of course, the cost reduces with time, and we need green hydrogen to make green steel. And when we looked at the price of green steel from these regions, of course, it reduces with time due to learning effects, but green steel is not competitive compared to steel from conventional BF. And you can see that the average price of steel is about $539 per ton of steel. And green steel today, which is current year's the crosses, it's as high as 1,200 in a province to as low as $800 per ton in a province. But China has an emission trading scheme which was recently launched. The carbon price today is about $11.9 per ton, which is much lower than the European Union. But China will also be facing the carbon border adjustment mechanism from both the UK and the EU. So that's a market mechanism that may support green steel. Now, if we compare the impact of the Chinese ETS and CBAM to see if it makes green steel cost competitive, you just focus on the ETS, which this graph shows. So all these dots and crosses are the price of green steel current year up until 2050. And the broken line are different assumptions around the ETS price. So the current ETS price in China converted to steel price, the impact of steel, and the future ETS price. And you see, even in the future, it's still not sufficient to make green steel cost competitive, because what the ETS will do is to make conventional steel more expensive, so green steel can have an opportunity to play in the market or be involved in the market. However, with CBAM, this changes because the price of carbon under CBAM is the same as the EU or the UK, which is higher than China's ETS. So they pay the difference. Again, you begin to see that some of these provinces become economically viable from 2030, for instance. Now, we thought of what other economic levers can make green steel competitive, and then we evaluated the using scrap steel, which is a way to make green steel sustainable. If you use 50% scrap in these plants without any sort of policies, you see some of them become, a lot of these plants actually become more economically viable. So they enter the shaded gray region from 2030s. In fact, one particular province is economically viable with scrap steel. And if you look at what's happening in China today with green steel as a way to validate this model, there's a lot of activity in these provinces where there is some form of economic viability today by using scrap. Even 20% scrap can bring them within this region of economic viability. And when you now integrate these market mechanisms like the ETS, you begin to see a lot more provinces become economic viable. So they cross the gray line with scrap usage. So the conclusion from this piece of work is market mechanisms are economic levers, but thinking of how to make the production process more sustainable to reduce costs, like using scrap steel, can make green steel economically viable. So I think I've reached a good point to conclude. I know it's a lot to take in, but there are challenges with steel decarbonization. A lot of the challenges I look at is the economics of it and how market mechanisms can create a business case for decarbonized steel. Around the world today, using our model, market mechanisms are not sufficient to close that gap for green steel, except in China, except of course can use scrap steel, then it becomes economically viable for certain provinces. So thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks a lot, Gbemi. Also for keeping it on time, unlike me. So what we'll do, no Q&A immediately now, but do please keep your questions or post them in the chat. And so what I'll do is that I'll invite Netmi to give the next presentation. Netmi, if you want to share your slides. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, right.
Thank you. Over to you.
You can see the screen and
Yep.
also hear me? Good. Right. So hello, everyone. I'm Netmi. So I'm a third-year PhD from Leiden University. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the environmental implications of decarbonizing European steel using a very well-known technique called life cycle assessment, and more like a futuristic life cycle assessment application. So I think Benoit gave a really nice introduction as to why it is important for us to quantify the emissions of steel making. So just to remind you, it is a very emission intensive and hard to decarbonize sector, and it accounts for 9 to 10% of the global CO2 emissions. And so it is important that we take a look at the existing steel production pathways like the blast furnace, and then also introduce novel materials and energy efficient ways to the existing pathways and retrofit these existing steel production plants to make it less emission intensive. And I guess in order to do that, we have to map the future emissions of these established and emerging steel production routes. So we can use several, I guess, industrial ecology related or sustainability assessment tools like life cycle assessment. And life cycle assessment also has several distinctions like attributional, consequential, prospective, dynamic life cycle assessment. But in this case, we will mostly be paying attention to prospective life cycle assessment. And in prospective life cycle assessment, we mostly talk about how the emissions will change depending on the future changes of the electricity and the energy mixes of the countries or regions. And we can also use the input-output analysis model, which is an economic technique to talk about how the demand and the supply, the imports and the exports from other countries can affect the emissions as well. And we can also use materials flow analysis, where we consider a certain space and then calculate the amount of inputs and outputs and flows within that certain geographical space. But in my case study, I've used prospective life cycle assessment, and I would like to talk to you about that. I'm studying about the European case study, and my research question was what are the environmental impacts of manufacturing a ton of steel in Europe using the DRI-EAF route with natural gas, and also natural gas with carbon capture and storage, biomethane, and electrolysis-based hydrogen from the years 2020 to 2050 for the scenarios net zero and the stated policies. So in order to define some of the goal and the scope that I use for the study, so the initial goal of the study was to quantify the environmental impacts for the DRI-EAF route for some of the scenarios that I mentioned above. And the scope definition, I considered the cradle to gate emissions, and I quantified the emissions for 1 ton of steel, which was the functional unit of the study. So whatever the results you're going to see is for 1 ton of steel. And I also quantified the values for the years between 2020 and 2050 for the geographical scope of Europe. And to quickly talk you through the technological scope of my alternatives, I think I used pellet production and the DRI and the electric arc furnace as some of the similar processes in all alternatives. And I also have the blast furnace as a reference case, so we can pay attention to how the DRI has changed compared to the blast furnace. And we have used mostly in the first case natural gas as the reducing agent. And in the second case, it's pretty much the same, except we apply carbon capture and storage for the EAF emissions and capture CO2 there. And in the third case, I use PEM-based hydrogen production. And in the fourth case, which is the biomethane-based, I have replaced the entire chain with biomethane. So in that case, we do not have natural gas injections to the system. We only have biomethane from the grid. So you will definitely see the benefits from that replacement in the results. So, right, to talk to you about the databases. So initially, obviously, we used the flowcharts and we gathered the information and modeled our initial LCA on EcoInvent 3.9. And once that was completed, we relinked the background scenarios to the shared socioeconomic pathways databases. So for the net zero scenario, I used the peak budget 500 database, and for the stated policies, I used the national determined contributions. And we use the open source activity browser for our LCA, and the impacts were calculated for the environmental footprint version 3.1. And for the life cycle inventory, as I mentioned before, after putting together the flowcharts, we went through each stage and we collected the materials, the energy, the water, and the air, and everything that is involved in the process, except for the capital equipment, because we made an assumption that the impact of capital equipments become negligible in the long run, because we don't necessarily see steel plants getting replaced that often. And we also quantified and collected the inventory for the emissions for each unit process. Just to talk to you a little bit about my case study and some of the points that were important for my own life cycle inventory. So we used twin papers that were developed by Sung et al. And we compiled the DRI-EAF and the blast furnace inventory using Sung et al. And then the changes that we made to these alternatives were done fundamentally based on these inventories. For the hydrogen-based inventory and the carbon capture and storage was compiled using Qiao, ETAL. And I think one of the problems that we encountered while we were compiling the inventory was the fact that we did not have a very descriptive biosphere, so which led to either quantifying all the emissions based on the carbon content, or actually using an existing inventory and then either scaling up or scaling down that based on the values that we already have. So we use the document called Best Available Technologies by Remus ETAL to cross-check some of the emissions that we calculated to see whether they are within the expected range. Yes, and for the biosphere flows, like I mentioned, the CO2 emissions we calculated using the mass balance, but obviously at the same time, to get the results for human toxicity, land use, and particulate matter, we needed other direct emissions. So we used some of the eco-invent entries like combustion of natural gas, combustion of biomethane, and hard core, and we only extracted the biosphere flows from that and made changes to that and used it as our biosphere inventory. And for the prospective LCA part, I think here it's important that we do not get this confused with the ex-ante LCA, because in the ex-ante LCA, you pretty much upscale your foreground and also your background information. But in my study, I'm only paying attention to the background flows. So because we did not have access to primary data for the foreground, and it was modeled using the premise framework, which uses integrated assessment models. Just to show you some of the results from my study. So I've only shown you the results for 2020 and 2050, and you will also see the contribution analysis for the scenarios. And you will see most of the contribution is coming from electricity generation, like NGCC power and lignite power. So generally, global warming impact has decreased under the net zero 2050 scenario. And as I mentioned, there's the lowest global warming impact is in biomethane based scenario, which is pretty much a 76% reduction compared to 2020. But obviously, it's important to remember that I have replaced the pellet production, the DRI, and the electric arc furnace completely with biomethane, which might not be feasible in a real life case study. But I guess we will see more insight into that in the supply chain assessment as well. And so for the natural gas-based routes, actually, they, with or without CCS, they remain pretty carbon intensive. not to mention, we need to consider and account for some of the bottlenecks coming with carbon capture and storage as well, leakages and all that. But it is not very lucrative, so to say, as of these results when we take a look at these results. And I think electrolysis-based hydrogen actually is offering very moderate reductions, which is about 543.9 kilograms, which is much better than obviously natural gas, but compared to biomass, it is still not the best. And just to generalize the contribution analysis for the scenarios, you can see emissions from fossil-based energy sources and also emissions from pellet production is declining, and you can see obviously improvements in cleaner inputs and processes. And under the stated policy scenario, you can see reductions, but it is not as aggressively reducing as the net zero emission scenario. And you can still see biomethane being at its lowest and natural gas being at its highest with the CCS. And for the hydrogen-based scenario, you can see about 637 kilograms per ton of steel, which is close to biomass, which is there's only a 300 difference there. And you can also see the reason for the less emissions as some of the fossil-based and process emissions are still existing in this step scenario, which obviously will contribute to slower decarbonisation. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the implications of these results. So I think it's important to understand some of the policy ambition is affecting the impact. And like I mentioned before, net zero by 2050 is showing better results compared to the state policy scenario. And obviously the biomass-based DRI is one of the best compared in the scenarios that we considered. Carbon capture and storage is helpful, but not the best, and it's limited. And hydrogen-based pathways are promising, but it's power dependent. Obviously, as long as I think in my scenario, I used wind power. So as long as you are relying on a renewable electricity grid, I think the benefits can be seen. And you will see some of the upstream emissions, also the things we address as indirect emissions, they shrink more under the net zero. And but under the step scenario, it's not the case, meaning we need more circularity related policies on a national level. Just to show you about the other impact categories, because there's obviously burden shifting, although the global warming impact is doing just fine, some of these indicators have changed. So what you see here is the results for 2050 compared to 2020. So I used a factor change for the indicators. So all pathways are reducing ionizing radiation by about 6 times in 2050 compared to 2020. And obviously, biomethane is showing reductions in non-renewable energy sources and freshwater eutrophications. But we don't see much differences in indicators like human toxicity, land use, or particulate matter. Though I think it's important to note here, for an example, if we are using biomethane, there might be an impact on land use change, which might be something to take a look into a bit deeper. And also, obviously, natural gas with CCS and without CCS is performing very similarly. And as I mentioned, some of the climate-aligned gains have not been extended to the rest of the indicators as well for the net zero. And this is the same analysis for the stated policy scenario. And in this case, you see more decline in ionizing radiation. And also for the biomethane, you still see the fossil-based resources declining, and also freshwater eutrophication reductions. And similar to the NCE, you still see the human toxicity showing no improvement, whereas for the land use and particulate matter, you see slight decreases across the pathways. And it's important to note that reductions for both net zero and for steps are, when it comes to other impact categories, are just very modest. And there's also less consistency in some of the impacts. But yes, they are fluctuating very similarly for the other impact indicators. So just to talk about the implications, I think I'm currently in the stage of looking a bit deeper into what exactly could be the factors that contribute to the net zero and the stated policy scenarios, because we have to interpret some of these results and connect them to the existing policies and some of the existing processes. And so it is still being interpreted as of now, the results. But just to talk to you about what this means generally, we do see strong reductions in ionizing radiation, non-renewable energy sources, and freshwater eutrophication generally throughout the scenarios. And obviously, we see the biomethane-based scenario being the most consistent performer in both scenarios generally. And for the net zero, I think it delivers lots of benefits, but it also leaves human toxicity and land use and particulate matter not changed, unchanged. So yes, when it comes to the stated policies, you obviously see bigger reductions in radiation. And like I mentioned before, some modest improvements in land use and particulate matter. But you do see there's not much improvement in the human toxicity factor, which is, I think, based on carcinogenics in my case. So these are things that can be improved and needs to be looked into. And also, it's important to understand yet again that climate gains are being paired with other impacts when we analyze some of these steel production pathways for environmental impacts. So that's it. That's all that I've got for today. But if you have any questions, I'll be very happy to answer. And thank you for listening.
Anthony, thanks a lot for your presentation.
Thank you.
Right, yes, to all the participants, please do post your questions in the chat. And that also gives a bit of a heads up to the speakers to think about it. So on that note, I think we reached the point where we wanted to have a short break. So we're just a few minutes late, so maybe we can shorten the break to 10 minutes, and then we will come back at 11, and then Yan can give a presentation then. Thank you, and see you shortly.
Break. ¿Tienes que hacer un envío?
Oh yeah, and you want to upload your slides just to be ready?
Yeah. 1 second.
That's great. Okay, so welcome back, everyone. I think we'll resume. So the floor is yours, Jan, to explain your case study.
Great, thanks all. Thanks, Benoit. Cool. Welcome back to the workshop. And here we are to sort of discuss some of the work we've done so far under the H2STEEL project in the optimization of how the H2STEEL process, which is a sludge-derived biocoal and hydrogen production technique, can be integrated into the steel-making supply chain. My slides are not moving at the moment. There. So for those of us who are a little less familiar with the work, I'll touch on this really quickly because Benoit's already been through this real quick. Here's a broad overview of the steel making process. It begins with iron making from iron ore, typically in a blast furnace, powered by fossil coke and coal. This iron is then fed into a basic oxygen furnace, which in turn makes primary steel. More recently, we have started decoupling iron and steel making processes where the iron ore can be reduced into iron using natural gas and to form direct reduced iron, DRI. And this is sent to the EAF, the electric arc furnace, alongside some scrap to make steel. Separately, we as humans, we generate quite a lot of waste, and this is normally made into sewage sludge through our wastewater treatment plants. This is currently normally sent into landfill and incineration. In fact, sludge is increasingly being incinerated, which of course releases CO2, because there have been people are increasingly concerned about soil contamination, toxicity when it is applied into landfill or agriculture. Therefore, the H2STEEL process suggests that the sludge goes through, an anaerobic digestion process to produce methane. The remnant material is then pyrolyzed to produce biocoal, a carbon-based material, and both the biocoal and biomethane are sent to a methane cracking unit, which splits this methane into hydrogen and bioanthracite. These materials can then replace some of the fossil-based materials used in steelmaking, hydrogen for nitro gas, and bioanthracite for fossil coal and coke. So more broadly, with our work under this project, what are some of the stuff we're trying to achieve? Firstly, we want to know how to integrate and roll out the process up to 2050. This means answering questions such as which wastewater treatment plants should be retrofitted with the relevant equipment, when should they be retrofitted, and in some cases, which steel-making plants should their products be sent to. Following that, we know that, of course, it is key to assess the impacts and feasibility of the derived integration strategies. So this would be in terms of understanding what the costs and benefits are associated with the derived integration strategy, and whether or not these are in line with the policies governing the relevant sectors. So where should we base our case study? Over here is a map of all of the steelmaking plants in Europe, colored by its main production processes. The most relevant technology for the H2STEEL process is the integrated DRI-EAF route. For those of you who are a little bit more eagle-eyed, with this rather small map, you may have noticed that there is only one integrated DRI-EAF facility in Europe at the moment. This is in Hamburg, right over here in the middle. Zooming in a little closer into this region, we can see that shown on this map within a 250-kilometer radius of this integrated steel plant, which is shown here in the middle in red. I'm not sure you can see my cursor actually. What's there in the middle?
We can see it.
Great, thanks. Are three shown here in the middle over there. Next to it are, 4 other BF-BOF plants, and also a myriad of wastewater treatment plants of various steel production capacities, which are represented by their marker size. So this makes for quite an interesting supply chain already. The routes on the map here is an initial effectively guess at what its supply chain could look like. In this particular sort of visual, we've selected the highest volume sludge producers as the suppliers to the integrated DRI-EAF, which we could see, it's probably not the most effective use of resources with, the long transportation routes and etc. in that scenario. So how can we do better? We've basically developed an optimization model with the following key dynamics, or in more jargon, its constraints. Firstly, we have a simplified H2STEEL value chain, and firstly, it has, if a wastewater treatment plant is retrofitted, it will produce biocoal using all of the sludge it produces. We've put in a limit that there's only an X number of wastewater treatment plants that can be retrofitted each year. This is an adjustable parameter depending on how comfortable, how much, and how much resources the city or municipality might have for this. So that is a parameter we can play with. Secondly, all of the produced biocoal is sent to the steel plant for cracking methane. When there is insufficient hydrogen being produced by this methane cracking unit, for example, we don't have enough retrofitted wastewater treatment plants as of yet, the model can choose to supplement the DRI production using either natural gas DRI or use supplementary methane and hydrogen from alternative sources. The key point about these externally sourced methane and hydrogen is that the model can also select whether or not it's biogenic or fossil. In a similar vein, supplementary fossil anthracite will be used when bioanthracite production is low. On the other hand, excess bioanthracite can be sold to neighboring blast furnaces or to other sectors such as cement making when the EAF has already used up everything that is needed. Effectively, we have an optimization model with a 25-year planning horizon, so this is up to 2050. The objectives are to minimize the cost of steelmaking and to minimize the corresponding direct emissions from this process. The key parameters are the locations and the sludge production capacities of the wastewater treatment plants, and also the material costs of the substitutable steel making materials. This gives us decision variables in the form of when each wastewater treatment plant starts producing biocoal, when fossil or biogenic materials are used, and when the production is being supplemented by the NGDRI route or being supplied by the alternative methane and hydrogen sources. Applying this to the Hamburg case study, we've currently looked at 2 different integration scenarios. The first is a baseline scenario where all of the wastewater treatment plants operate individually. This derives integration strategies for satisfying the production capacity of the steelmaking plant and doesn't really care about the impact on the wastewater treatment plants. The second is a clustered scenario where biocoal production is semi-centralized to find more strategic ways that would not only satisfy the production capacity of the steelmaking plant at minimal cost to the plant, but also to reduce the cost of production of biocoal. So let's get stuck in with some of our results. This is a trade-off, scatter plot of the direct emissions versus costs to steelmaking, the cost to the steelmaking plant. We can see that the cost of steelmaking increases with reducing emissions this is fairly intuitive as a result. We can kind of see quite interestingly, there is actually a threshold emission level under which the system would start suggesting producing surplus bioanthracite, where you can then start selling these to the neighboring plants. Looking a little closer into the DRI production routes for each of these scenarios. So here we have decreasing, decreasing emissions in each of these scenarios. We can see that NGDRI is actually not being used at all. We've used instead supplementary methane and hydrogen instead. It's also interesting to note for that similar threshold level, we have a decreasing use in the supplementary sort of production routes. So we need an increase in volume of DRI production via the H2STEEL process. In this here, we have the proportion of biogenic and fossil methane and hydrogen used in each of the emission reduction scenarios. On the left here, we have that for methane, and on the right for hydrogen. It's now quite obvious, looking into this, that the reason why costs increase with reducing emissions is because the fossil sources of the gases are replaced with greener options. Over here with the blue. We can also kind of see that because biomethane is actually much cheaper than electrolysis-derived hydrogen, biomethane is used more readily as an initial emissions reduction strategy, being employed, closer towards like 5,000 tons of CO2 versus as we really need to reduce our emissions kind of segment over here on the right for hydrogen. When we look at the impact of this on the wastewater treatment, the cost to the wastewater treatment plants as in total, so this is the network of wastewater treatment plants, we can see that the costs increase significantly beyond this little threshold over here, our little nice 3,000 tons of CO2. So we can see that significant reductions in emissions will require an increase in biocoal production. And with that, without the sharing of retrofitted resources, the number of retrofitted wastewater treatment plants explode. So if we looked at the map of where our suppliers are, it looks a bit like this. So costs to the wastewater treatment plant network is actually directly tied to the number of plants that have been retrofitted because of course, we're not sharing any of these facilities. What would then be, the derived logistical network kind of look like? In the minimally retrofitted cases, we can see that, most of these selected plants are actually not the most local to the steel plant. This is likely because we've actually not quite included yet the distance between the wastewater treatment plants and the steel plants, at least in this current iteration of the work. We see that it actually sort of attempts to match the biocoal anthracite production to what is needed in the steel plant. On the other end of the spectrum, the resultant network for the low emissions kind of scenario, we have a very complex logistical network. This unfortunately can become a barrier to implementation, as this would require significant coordination efforts and, effectively a lot of trucks and a lot of associated emissions with that. So what we've seen so far is that from the baseline scenario, the cost incurred for retrofitting wastewater treatment plants individually is very high. So looking a bit more strategically, we have a cluster scenario where within each cluster, a single wastewater treatment plant is retrofitted. All sludge produced within that cluster is then processed through that single retrofitted wastewater treatment plant. The initial approach for the clustering of wastewater treatment plants is a distance-based agglomerative clustering approach. The distance matrix is calculated using the coordinate locations of the wastewater treatment plants, and we've not put in a limit on the total sludge production allowed within each cluster at the moment. On the right here, we can see that this is sort of the derived integration strategy of when each cluster should be retrofitted and where they are located. So again, a lot of wastewater treatment plants are being involved here. The key point about this, though, is that our wastewater treatment, the cost to the wastewater treatment plant network is actually significantly reduced by 38% at its maximum in comparison to the baseline scenario. Some of the sort of additional impacts that we've not yet discussed in our results at the moment, which includes increasing the scope of the assessment, actually is some of the other emissions sort of sources. So this is the avoided emissions from sludge incineration. So instead of producing CO2 and recovering energy from that, we have avoided CO2 emissions from that. We've also avoided some emissions from fertilizer production, and also the impact of emissions reductions associated with the use of spare bioanthracite in the other plants. Finally, just to sort of give a taste for our next steps looking into the future market infrastructures, we have here is a picture of what is the expected capacity, steelmaking capacity change over the next 25 years. This is based on company announcements and plans, basically available online that they've made available online. We can see that the total steelmaking capacity is expected to increase in the near term, but will eventually return to levels close to the current production capacities. The total iron making capacity is actually expected to decrease over time. This is because a lot of the blast furnace, integrated blast furnace and blast oxygen furnace plants are being closed. This difference in iron making is expected to be filled through the increase in use of scrap recycling, scrap steel and recycling. When that did not match up quite just yet, but yeah, if we see the breakdown into how that actually happens, we can first see an increase, a significant increase in EAF steel production. We can see a decrease in BOF steel, and because this is an integrated process, there is a corresponding decrease in BF iron production. Finally, on the bottom over here, which is quite promising, we can see a pretty big increase in DRI production. So, which is good news for the H2STEEL process, because that is where this process can be integrated and really make an impact. So, in summary, we've basically been able to characterize the costs and efforts required for different levels of abatement through the optimization and integration of the process into a existing case study steelmaking plant. We have found that the cost to steelmakers increase as emissions are reduced. This is because we've needed to use more expensive sources of biogenic methane and electrolysis hydrogen. The cost of biocoal production, or the cost to the wastewater treatment plant network, can be reduced significantly if biocoal production is semi-centralized. So we need to be a little bit more strategic about how we integrate and roll the process. And finally, our further work as we are coming to the end of the project in the final 6 months included increasing this existing scope of the assessment to include some of the avoided emissions in other systems, and also to consider changes to the existing steelmaking structure to ensure that our integration strategies are robust in the next 25 years or so. Cool. Thanks for listening. There is, if we've not already seen yet, that is the link to the project for more information and for more updates.
Thanks a lot, Jan. Andrea, I think I will let you take over from here, and I'm going to disappear from the call, sadly. Thank you all.
Thanks, Benoit.
Thank you. Yeah, I think in the meantime also Gbemi had to leave, but I asked her like over the chat the first question. So the first question we received was about the Trump administration, and after Trump, there's a tendency of giving up the decarbonization initiatives in the US. How will this affect the carbonization of steel in the US and the world? So Gbemi also informed there's Elsie, who's part of her group and will be able to answer some questions. So if you want to unmute yourself and turn the camera on. But yeah, essentially what Gbemi told me about like what she thinks about this question is like, sure, there is change going on there, but and it will affect both the US and the global market, as without these US initiatives, there will be less kind of information of first investment decisions to learn from. But at the same time, the red states have benefited more than others from these from like Inflation Reduction Acts. And the blue steel is viable with current initiatives in the US. And it would be kind of hard for Trump to withdraw all the support. So it's not super clear what's going to happen for real. But yeah, that's kind of what her view is about this topic. And at the same time, China is ramping up policies for the steel sector, and this will give kind of a push to also other countries, again, because you could have some information about what's going to happen if a policy is in place. So that was about the Trump administration. So Elsie, if you want to add something, feel free. And there was another question also from Hassan. And I think this is both for like Nefmi and maybe Elsie, or maybe even Jan. So whoever wants to answer about it. So it's, what do you think about importing green iron to the European Union instead of producing it inside the European Union because of energy costs and lack of or less amount of renewable energies? So kind of producing green iron outside the EU, where like either costs or availability of renewable is better, than import the green iron. So yeah, who wants to take the first answer to this? Yes, yeah, go for it. If you want to introduce yourself as well, again, maybe I can make you presenter. Oh yes, yeah, I'll do that. Sorry, okay.
Hi everyone, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So my name is Elsie. I'm Dr. Gbemi's PhD student, and I work on these market-based mechanisms. Just to answer my view, or what we were able to find from the research we're doing on importing the we can say the iron ore or the raw material into Europe. So there are two ways. I'm going to present two consequences for this, and then two ways the European Union and the UK today are kind of countering this phenomena or this, this trade. So for the two, how this could play out, or the two drawbacks or consequences are that if you decide to import from outside, the European Union will lose its position as an entity that is producing. So you're going to lose a lot of the factories' work, or the opportunity of EU to become self-reliant if it's going to keep importing that. The second consequence is the fact that it's going to become more or less not a political pressure, but rather it's going to be dependent on, if we can say they're going to, let's say, import it from China or India, they're going to become more reliant on this trade relationship, and this could impact other foreign policies, other industrial endeavors of the EU, given that it's going to be dependent on its counterparts now, on its trading partners. Now, what the EU is doing now, given that, yes, green or clean technology is cheaper outside the EU and the UK. So what is the EU doing now is they are introducing in 2027 the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is for countries. I mean, China has introduced an ETS, but it's still more or less on the level of power. Dr. Gbemi talked a bit about how it's going to be introduced to steel, but it's still more prominent on power. So what the EU is doing is it's introducing in 2027 the CBAM, as I said, and it's a tax where, as a trading partner, if you don't have your own kind of market mechanism, or you don't have a certification that your steel or your end product is clean, you would have to pay a tax. And this, the EU will use it in, will recycle it for other industries, will use it in for its own ETS, etc. But this will make this clean or green trade, like imported product, more expensive. So this is for that. I think I wanted to say something else. Oh, there's also the certification, the MRV process, which we didn't talk about in our research yet. It's another student who's working on that. But in a lot of cases, when we say it's a clean, there are specific standards in the EU that are not followed by other trading partners, or as they say, which makes it difficult for a product to check all the kind of to check the bucket list for why product can be clean or green. I think this is also one of the restrictions that the EU is imposing. So I think this is my view. Happy to take any other question. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it was very comprehensive. Any other questions from the room, or follow-up question from Hassan? If you want, so I don't know if you can unmute yourself or not, but maybe raise your hand if you have a question, or post it in the chat. Think, okay, there's a new one coming up. No, thank you for the answer. All right. So okay. I don't know if you want to add something, maybe Nefmi, or Jan, just to try and steer some thoughts.
I think for the second question about the renewable energy grid, I think Europe is doing much better than the rest of the world when it comes to the LCA and the emissions based on renewable-based electricity grid. So I do think keeping green iron production within the EU by just, I think as of now, I think EU is importing quite a bit of iron ore from India. So that itself is contributing to a lot of emissions, upstream emissions. But in terms of renewable energy and electricity mixes, I think EU is doing much better than the rest of the world. So yeah.
Yeah, I think one maybe thing to add is, of course, the China action is quite important. First of all, because they are like very big producer, and also they're kind of probably longer term strategies is a bit more stable than Europe or US, where like new president gets elected and can change pretty much everything, especially in the US. So yeah, I think it's going to be good to have, I mean, ideally both US and China involved, but yeah, if China has some decisive policy action, it's going to be very, very important for like globally. In terms of renewable, I agree. So Europe is interesting, but yeah, there are other countries that potentially have more capacity. So not I'm not an expert on this. I think about the production. Yeah, and if you can pull up your slides, I think there was one thing maybe it's good to just clarify. I think you had one slide where you had like the overall production.
The overall production. Can you see my slides?
Yes. Maybe towards the end.
Oh, where's it? This one. Overall production.
Yeah. So I think here it's kind of good to point out there's the total steel is fairly stable, but there's some up and downs, right? So does this include the scrap steel, or is it virgin steel production?
Yeah, so this actually includes all steel production. So yeah, has the secondary steel as well included in that just based on the EAF plants, basically. And this is this is only the steel making capacities in Europe, and this does not consider the rest of the world at the moment.
All right. So this is a primary and secondary production in Europe without imports.
Without imports. This is just production in Europe.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so just on, I guess like in Hassan's question about importing green iron into the EU, of course the H2STEEL project is very much about like keeping it within the EU as well. And I guess that is to sort of maintain the sort of internal market and production capacity such that, there are still a lot of, we do have a significant steel industry, a lot of livelihoods dependent on this. So this is this is a key way to sort of try and preserve that industry within this continent. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions from the room? Yeah, I think we can wait wait if something comes up. Otherwise, we maybe can close a bit earlier. Yeah, last chance. Oh, there's a new post. Let's see. Yes, so it's also from Azan. So there are many initiatives like biochar, biocoal as secondary carbon carriers for iron making and steel making processes, especially in Europe. What do you think how these materials can be used in industry, and what are the barriers to widely using them? So I think I can probably start. So talking about a bit about the H2STEEL process project, sorry. So as you may have noticed in the initial slides, so we have ArcelorMittal in the on board, and one of the plans for like these last 6 months is also to test some of the bioanthracite that is produced not by us that are doing mostly modeling, but by Record and Polito. So they are they will start a pilot plant and essentially have samples of this bioanthracite, and the idea is to test it on a real or almost real plant managed by ArcelorMittal to see how it behaves in a real process. So I think there are, of course, some uncertainty around it, mostly regarding, I think, the mechanical behavior of this pelletized bioanthracite compared to standard coal, which is used for a very long time, and of course, industry knows very well how to use it. And so I think this is one good aspect of our process specifically. And I think it's an answer that any other kind of biochar and biocoal producer need to get before using it in a real iron and in a real steel manufacturing plant. Beside of like the technical feasibility, I think another barrier can be, of course, the cost, and this is where maybe policy or interventions or other like levers can become important. Again, like briefly speaking about the like the H2STEEL process specifically. So there's when you produce this bioanthracite and you get some hydrogen, since this initial material is sludge, you have atoms that you don't need, actually you don't want in steel manufacturing plants, which are mostly nitrogen and phosphorus. And the idea is that to get this biocoal, you add a leaching step where you kind of extract these heteroatoms, and you get as a byproduct something that can be used as fertilizer. So you get a phosphorus-rich fertilizer that helps also the like economic aspects of it if you can sell it for like as a byproduct instead of having like something to dispose of. So I think it's kind of there's a lot of aspects that has to be considered, both economical aspects and technical aspects, but potentially there's like good integration between at least within our projects. I don't know if you had like specific processes in mind, but this is a kind of what H2STEEL is looking at. Again, if Jan or Nefmi wants to add something, feel free to unmute yourself.
I think maybe from an LCA perspective, there's a bit of controversy when you're modeling bio-based products, because there's no benchmark as to whether we are going to include the thermal upgrading processes which operate at high temperatures and requires lots of energy, and that can again contribute to emissions. So that's one associated with using bio-based products. And the second one would be, obviously in our H2STEEL project, we are using sewage sludge, which is a waste, but we don't always use waste-based products for bio-based productions. Sometimes you can use cultivations, and if you are cultivating, there might be impacts on land use change. I think I pointed that out during my presentation as well, which needs to be accounted for if that's the case. And so it is a bit of a gray area as of now, how LCA works when it comes to bio-based products. And I would like to add that maybe an LCA, when it comes to any bio-based material, will become more comprehensive if you can add a supply chain assessment as well. Then that way you can see that whether that can be actually operated in real life as well. But yes.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I also like to kind of add to that. Whenever you use like bio-based materials, you have like a lot of kind of variability. In terms of sludge, in the H2STEEL process, the focus is mostly on sewage sludge. Even though technically you could also address industrial sludge. The main issue there is that while sewage sludge is kind of consistent throughout like countries or like geographical areas, industrial sludges are way more diverse, because depending on the industry you're looking at, you can have like completely different feedstocks. So it will be hard to get like a general assessment unless you start looking at several different industries and look how the different sludges behaves. Yeah, that's something I wanted to add. The other thing is like on the LCA, as Nefmis also already mentioned, you start to have like data gaps when you look at biomass, because there's like more than so there's like, again, a lot of variability, so not all the options are very well characterized. So you might have to fill the gaps with additional experiments or modeling work or both. Jan, did you want to add something as well? Or?
Yeah, so, well, just to address quickly the question, one of the key barriers to, if we're talking about using biocoal, biochar, bioanthracite in steelmaking, Andrea's already touched on it. It's very much on the material quality that of the biochar. So at the moment, it seems like, there is opportunity to, have it replacing sort of pulverized coal, but not so much in terms of the coke. If you are referring to how sort of biocoal, biochar, bioanthracite, biomaterials can be used more widely in different industries, there are, of course, a lot of work at the moment on biofuels. So, on the transport fuel kind of sector, there is also increase in interest for this for the cement sector. So there is actually quite a lot of opportunity for this material at the moment. The key barrier is effectively, the same as that for steel making. It is about the quality. It's about whether or not you can get the, unwanted sort of materials out of the product effectively and in a cost efficient way.
Thank you, Jan. Yeah, I think we covered the last question. And in terms of time, we are doing good, I think. So we have like another 10 minutes in the agenda. So let's see if we have some additional. Yes, there's one from Daniel on the supply chain part. So for Jan, have you looked into the variability in the composition of sewage sludge and how this may affect the quality of biocoal? Andrea kind of answered this when I was typing. And the second curiosity, have you considered to integrate the policy instruments like carbon tax subsidies, etc., into the supply chain optimization framework?
Yeah, thanks, Daniel.
Yeah,
I think that's for me.
yeah.
Yeah, so just off for the supply chain work, we've actually, just because there's so much ongoing work, we've sort of gone ahead assuming that, the composition of sewage sludge will be dealt with appropriately. So the short answer is no. For the supply chain optimization part itself, we've not looked into the variability in the composition of the sewage sludge. For the second part of your question on the policy instruments, we have been looking at how that impacts, the market, but at the moment, it's not been integrated into the framework yet. That is also mostly because we've currently looked at just a singular sort of very localized case study, whereas currently a lot of the policies are on a much larger scale. So that or we're envisioning that to be incorporated once we zoom out into that more national and European level type sort of scale.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this was right on point.
And I think that actually kind of, covers a little bit into the Gbemi's sort of area and work about the policy integration side as well. So that covers that a little bit.
Yeah. Nice. Okay, then I think unless there are like other questions, we can probably go to a close. So it's 7 to 12 in the UK. So thanks for attending and for the questions, and also, of course, to all the presenters. So the project will go on until March next year, and there's going to be some interesting development coming up, especially from the experimental side, since they've built this pilot plant to test some materials, and they will produce good amounts of products to test, like again in a real system. So keep an eye on the website and on the project if you're interested in the topics. And enjoy the rest of your day. And thanks to Fernando as well for organizing the call and setting the link, etc. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. I hope to upload this on the project's YouTube channel. So for those of you who want to rewatch the entire thing, we will be uploading it on the next few hours. Okay, so thank you very much for bearing with us all this time, and I hope to see you in our next workshop.
Or share it with your friends who can't join.
Thank you.
Well,
Okay. Thank you
thanks a
very
lot
much.
all.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.